All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Isabel Molina, the public programs producer here at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to the that's loud, third annual New York Jewish Book Festival. Thank you for joining us for Deconstructing Jewish Masculinity, featuring authors Ronnie Grinberg, Dr. Miriam Eve Mora, and Sarah Imhoff, and moderated by Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank. We hope you will explore some of the 17 panels that are happening throughout the museum today, meet some of the 56 speakers, attend one of our 3 writing workshops, and get books signed at some of the 16 author signings. We also hope you will join us for a concert by Marcin Mazecki and Gur Mandolin Orchestra at 6 p.m. in Safra Hall on the first floor. While you are here, we also encourage you to visit our exhibitions and our Cafe Locks on the second floor. The whole museum is open to you today. You can also pick up holiday gifts at the Pickman Museum shop and purchase the books discussed today through McNally Jackson in our first floor lobby. This program is made possible in part by support from the Battery Park City Authority, and your donations also help us present programs like these. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Ronnie Grinberg is the author of Write Like a Man, Jewish Masculinity and the New York Intellectuals. She is Associate Professor of History and core faculty member of the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Miriam Eve Mora is the author of Carrying a Big Schtick, Jewish Acculturation and Masculinity in the 20th Century. She is a historian of American immigration and ethnic history with a focus on Jewish American gender identity. Sarah Imhoff is the author of Masculinity and the Making of American Judaism. She is Jay and Janine Schroederstein Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor in the Department of Religious Studies and the Bourne's Jewish Studies program at Indiana University. Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank is Director of the Center for Education Advocacy at American Jewish Committee, AJC, where she oversees AJC's work on combating anti-Semitism and fostering inclusion of Jewish students and faculty in K-12 and higher education spaces. Thank you again for joining us. I'm going to hand things over to our speakers.
Thank you so much. I want to make it very clear everyone here on the panel is a doctor and worked darn hard for that PhD. Okay, so I'm really thrilled to be moderating a panel on this topic, which is such a fascinating one, and you're going to hear so much more. I'm not going to talk about it at all. I'm going to leave that to our panelists. You're going to hear so much more about why looking at masculinity is such an interesting and important lens for examining Jewish history, Jewish identity, the Jewish past, the Jewish present, and perhaps we'll even get into the Jewish future. So thank you so much for being here today, and I am just going to jump right in with our wonderful panelists. And our first question is, tell us what your book is about. And we're going to start with Ronnie, just to give us, like, what's your elevator pitch? Tell us about your book. And I have copies of the books here on my lap. All 3 of them are actually page turners, and part of that is because I'm a Jewish history nerd, but they really are just incredible books, so I highly encourage you to buy them.
Okay, it's on. Hi, I'm Ronnie Grinberg, and my book is called Write Like a Man, Jewish Masculinity and the New York Intellectuals. For those of you who might know or not know, the New York Intellectuals were a prominent group of mostly male and mostly Jewish, a bit secular Jewish, writers and critics in the middle of the 20th century. Who came, who came to define, in many ways, American literary life in the 20th century. They were the editors and writers for magazines like Partisan Review and Commentary, the New York Review of Books, Dissent, among others. And my book looks at how Jewish masculinity, a secular Jewish masculinity, shaped this important group of thinkers. It's men and the few women who were considered part of the group, and how that vision of a Jewish masculinity, which I argue is a combative, kind of intellectualized masculinity that's performed on the written page, how that kind of shaped American literary life and politics in the 20th century, contributing to debates about Cold War liberalism, neoconservatism, feminism, some of sort of the biggest subjects of that period. That's the short elevator pitch.
Go ahead, Miriam.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. My book, as an immigration and ethnic historian, my book really looks at how Jewish American masculine identity plays into the acculturation process. So one of the things that I try and unearth is where generally held assumptions about Jewish manhood came from and how Jewish men and women attempted to change those views. So I find that there are some generally very well-known archetypes of Jewish men, and the book tries to investigate those and determine where they came from and how acts to either change or explain or further reify or reinforce those perceptions of Jewish manhood act as a motivator for historical change throughout the 20th century. And we'll get much more into the details of that, I think.
So we're going basically in reverse chronological order. My book looks at the early 20th century as a critical moment for understanding Jewish gender. This is for reasons that you are probably already familiar with. This is a moment of significant immigration, and it's also a significant time of intra-Jewish diversity. So we have acculturated Jews who feel very American. We have Jews who are arriving, who sometimes want to aspire to be American. We have some friction between those groups, and we also have some synergy between them. So this time, I think, becomes a really important moment for solidifying some of the themes that we see in Miriam and Ronnie's books about what it means to be a Jewish man and how Jewish masculinity fits in with other kinds of American masculinity.
So as we dive more deeply into the subject, I want everyone to keep in mind that we're going to leave some time at the end for questions. So as you're listening to these incredibly brilliant panelists, think about what you want to ask them at the end. Okay, so how did you come to write this book? What made you interested in the topic of masculinity? It's such an interesting kind of a topic. And now I'm going to go in chronological order. We'll start with Sarah, and then I'll start with Miriam. I'm going to change it up every time.
Here also chronological order because my book was published a little before these other wonderful books. So the origin story for this is when I wrote my dissertation, it was about both masculinity and femininity, men and women, in the early 20th century. And I was investigating the idea of complementarity in many ways. So that is the idea that women and men are different or opposite or complementary. And as I applied for a few grants, as one does when one writes a dissertation, I did not get them, but I got the feedback that said, this book says it's about gender, but half of it is about men. And I thought, oh, these things are evaluated by important scholars. They don't just send out random questionnaires. There are important scholars who are in my field and adjacent to my field who think that women are the place of gender and that women have gender and maybe men don't. And so as I decided on a first book project, I thought, that's where I really think there should be an important contribution, to think about Jewish men as having masculinity, as that being a thing that gets constructed in historical time rather than some kind of essential men have always been like X, right? There's a lot of how do women's roles change in history? But you know what? Men's roles also change in history. And that was something that I really wanted to bring to the field. So that was how I ended up writing a book about masculinity rather than gender more generally, because it was an important thing, I think, for the field of American Judaism and American Jewish history at the time.
Miriam, go ahead.
I want to be very clear before I say this, because I'm going to say statements like nothing existed like this, that when I started this project, it was before Sarah's wonderful book came out in 2017, when I was already, neck deep in my dissertation. Well, I came from a very non-historical academic background. So my first couple of degrees were in photography, and my master's degree was in genocide studies, and I was focusing on representation of genocide in film. And what I found, it was 2000, dating myself very specifically here, but when I was working on my master's, it was 2008, and these 6 major motion pictures about the Holocaust had come out. And my master's thesis evaluated those 6 films, and I thought really highlighted a significant and strange moment in cinema where victimization and villainization in representations of the Holocaust seemed to shift. And I was trying to figure out why that was, why Jewish men were being presented by a very different category of actor, I would say, like Daniel Craig, as opposed to Ben Kingsley, and why Nazis were being portrayed in more sympathetic roles, not just Germans, like in The Reader, but Nazis, like in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and why these men were becoming more sympathetic and less militaristic. And it boiled down to some basic questions about who people think Jewish men are. And when I was working on this, everyone answered those questions with these really matter-of-fact tones, like, well, people like seeing Jews in defiant roles because Jewish men aren't defiant. Or people like seeing, Inglorious Bastards, which came out at the end of my thesis, because it's about time that someone had stood up, which is very ahistorical. But the answers were so clearly based on these assumptions about the realities of Jewish men, but the only evidence that could be provided was more pop culture. So what I set out to write was this history of Jewish men, which looked at what actual Jewish men are actually doing throughout the 20th century. And they are fighting wars, and they are refusing to fight wars, and they are, interacting with women in positive ways and in negative ways, and they are engaging in crime. And that's why I will point to the cover, since it happens to be right here. That's why I like my cover so much. This is actually my great-grandfather on the upper right. But I like it because this is a Jewish fraternity picture from 1922, and they're all literally wearing different hats. And that's kind of the idea of the book, is to show that Jewish men are really coming from all these, they were just goofing, but, they come from all these different places, and they do all these different things, and a lot of them are in direct response to these assumptions about what Jewish manhood is, should be, and can be.
Okay, I'm going to go.
It's not working.
Is it working now? No. Okay. Now you guys can hear me. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm also going to date myself. Mine was also a kernel of what became my book, which came out in the spring this year, was a dissertation that began at Northwestern University on neoconservatism. I wasn't going to grad school to train in Jewish studies. I was in a graduate school program for 20th century US American history. And if you recall, in the early 2000s, George W. Bush was president. This might now seem like a quaint time compared to what we live in now. But at the time, it didn't seem that way. And I had been living in New York City. I went to Barnard. I worked in book publishing before I went to grad school. Was here on September 11th, as I imagine many of you were. And the war on terror came to define the Bush administration. And for those, there's a lot of people my age or older in the audience. When I teach my students, like, none of this resonates. But if you recall, neoconservatism was a buzzword to explain the foreign policy, sort of the muscular foreign policy of the Bush administration, kind of preemptive war going from Afghanistan and then the invasion of Iraq. Meanwhile, when I got to graduate school in 2004, there was a big shift in American history, or not shift, but there was the hot topic was studying conservatism, which remains actually the case today, because the sense that historians had that liberalism had triumphed in the 20th century with the rise of the New Deal order and the Great Society programs seemed in the wake of Reagan. And then after Bush elected it as not the history of the 20th century. So there was Alan Brinkley, who was a Columbia historian, famously had an article in 1994 where he sort of lamented that there weren't enough, I can't remember what it's called. I always remember Leo Rebuffo's response, which I'll get to. But anyways, about why there were so many, why there weren't enough books on conservatism. So I was part of that moment. And I read an article by Francis Fukuyama, who was associated with neoconservatism, a political scientist, in 2006, where he was lamenting, actually, that neoconservatism had gone too far with the invasion of Iraq. Remember, we didn't find weapons of mass destruction. And he said it didn't have to be this way. It began with a group of Jewish intellectuals at City College, the sons of immigrants in the 1930s. And by that point, I was also reading Norman Podhoretz, who is one of the grandfathers of neoconservatism. He was the editor of Commentary from 1945 to 1960, or to 1990. I don't want to take too long. I wrote a dissertation. It was not a very good dissertation, but as my advisor told me, a done dissertation is a good dissertation. Okay. And when I finally got a job, which took about 5 years, I had to assess what book I wanted to write. Now, why was my dissertation not a good dissertation? Because people associated with neoconservatism like Daniel Bell and Nathan Glazer are much more complicated figures who didn't stay with neoconservatism over the longue durée. And I didn't really deal with that. At the same time, I loved Irving Howe, and he was a major part of my dissertation, but he is definitely not a neocon. So when it came to thinking about what book did I want to write, and now I had more freedom because I wasn't under advisors at grad school who had a particular vision about conservatism. Not that that's, I said I wanted to write a broader story about Jewish masculinity and the New York intellectuals. And as it evolved, it also came to be a story about how the few women operated in this masculine milieu as well, which we'll get to, I'm sure.
Okay, so we've set up a framework now, and now I want to dive deeper and kind of open up what your books are actually, the questions your books are dealing with, and kind of what kind of answers you're coming up with. So I'm going to ask you kind of a complicated question, or a multi-part question. What does it mean to study masculinity and its intersection with Jewish identity? Because there's really, all three of your books are dealing with two identities, but really many, many identities, because neither masculinity nor Jewish identity is a monolith, as we know. But what does it mean to study those two together? What are the questions that you're dealing with? What are the questions that are coming up? And we've touched a little bit on those questions, but let's open them up a little deeper. Why is masculinity a helpful lens for looking at Jewish identity, and maybe vice versa? And Miriam, I'm starting with you this time.
There's a lot of good questions packed into that. What I'm drawing out from it is why is masculinity a good lens, and how does it add to our discussion of Jewish identity?
Yeah.
And why is it important to study Jewish identity and masculinity in context?
Right.
So I think one of the and I'm going to reference Sarah's book right off the bat. One of the most useful ways to talk about masculinity is in relationship to the hegemon, to the dominant masculinity. And Sarah's book does a very good job of talking about looking to the margins and to marginalized masculinities to see, to help identify what the hegemon really is. I think she did an excellent job of that, so I will leave more of that to her. I think one of the reasons that it's, it adds, I think it adds tremendously. The big kind of argument of my book, I would say, is that we need to add masculinity to our discussions of history, and particularly of Jewish history, because it is and has been a motivator for action, for real action. So I'm a social and cultural historian, and one of the things I look at is the ways that people actually make moves that make history, and how those are guided at times by masculinity. And I'll give you an example of that from here in New York. Spoiler alert, a lot of my book takes place in New York. But for example, in this idea that Jewish men are not physically fit, right? This is one of the many stereotypes that I look at. And Jewish men reacted to this, so I look at where it came from, right? Where ideas of hegemonic masculinity were coming from. I begin at the early 20th century, so I talk about Teddy Roosevelt, and I talk about his kind of idea of rugged manhood, and this idea of being a self-made man, which honestly opens a lot of doors for Jewish men to join in that project. But the way that Jewish men themselves are discussing assumptions of Jewish male identity, which are largely imported from Europe, they react to it in a number of ways, right? They either say, well, this is not true, right? Jewish men are not weak. And so they either dismiss it or they engage in a kind of performative masculinity to disprove it, for example, founding athletic clubs that are openly Jewish, like the Jacob, the Jewish Athletic Club of Brooklyn, right, Jacob. Or they say, actually, this is a problem. Jewish men are less physically fit. Jewish men are less tough, but it's not genetic. It's cultural, right? It's through centuries of oppression and being not allowed to join in your athletic clubs. So they make other athletic clubs, like the City Athletic Club in Manhattan, which becomes one of the largest athletic clubs in the city, is founded entirely by Jews who are excluded from Irish and other athletic clubs, and says nothing about its Jewishness, but just works to actually make Jewish men more physically fit and better at sports without publicizing it, right? So they actually say, yes, this is true, but it doesn't have to be. And then there's another thread, as you say, not monolithic, of Jewish men who say, this is true, and we're proud of it, right? We're not a combative people. We're not an athletic people. We're an intelligent and scholarly and well-read and learned people. And they push back against this, and they say, we're going to embrace this more effeminate, or as Daniel Boyarin said, sissy masculinity, right? Jewish masculinity that is intentionally and proudly less masculine. So there is no one dominant theme, but I think that by looking at masculinity as a part of Jewish history, and this dialogue about masculinity as an integral part of Jewish American history specifically, it allows us to understand some of the social movements that Jews have engaged in. I take it in my book all the way through 1973, and I think some of the areas where it crops up are very compelling. Like, for example, in the protest movement in the 1960s, I talk about the Weather Underground and Columbia protests and their interaction with Black nationalism and their kind of striving for other forms of masculinity through different kinds of masculine behavior. So I think it's applicable. If, as I say, if there's one argument of my book, is that you can apply this pretty much anywhere. You can say what in this discussion really boils down to gender. Why did Jewish women leave the anti-war protest movement in 1968 in droves to become, the leaders of second wave feminism? Maybe it's because Jewish men in the movement were trying so desperately to prove their masculinity that they were doing so by belittling and oppressing the women in the movement. Right, there's some of that at play. So I think it really informs everything we study, and should inform everything we study, because it's a huge part of national identity. Right, kind of that aspirational white malehood is incredibly important to everything we talk about here, especially now, I would argue.
Yeah, shining a light on that, which is, I feel, in previous generations was just like the norm. As I don't remember which one of you talks about that extensively in your introduction. I think it was you, Miriam. Yeah, that norm, like the non-marketness. It's really interesting to say, okay, we're actually going to market, and we're going to look at it more deeply. Okay, let's see, Sarah.
So, I think I'll try to answer a complementary part of your question, which is, why does studying Jewish masculinity tell us something about either broader history or masculinity more broadly? And this was something that I didn't have on my radar as I started my project, and then as I continued my project became really compelling to me, which is to understand that there are multiple masculinities, and that Jewish masculinity is one of these. And so it doesn't have to be this option between either you do the normative masculinity or the hegemonic masculinity, or you're effeminate, which has been one of the sort of folk stories that Jews tell themselves, like, oh, Jewish men are just effeminate. But our choices in the world are not just do hegemonic masculinity or be effeminate. There are, in fact, many modes of masculinity, and that's one of the things we can see really across these books, too. So thinking about Jewish masculinity as having some of its own ideas and ideals, like Miriam is suggesting, the non-combative or non-violent. I talk a lot about crime and how both Jews and non-Jews imagined that Jewish men didn't commit violent crimes. So for many non-Jews, this was actually kind of an anti-Semitic stereotype. Oh, they're not brave enough or strong enough to commit these crimes. Theodore Bingham, who was the commissioner in New York, actually says something almost exactly to that effect, that Jews only commit these softer crimes. Now, for Jews, of course, this wasn't a bad thing at all. This was terrific. Like, we don't commit these violent crimes. It's also super interesting that at this very moment, there are Jewish men committing crimes. There are Jewish mobsters, but everyone forgets about them while they're telling the story about Jewish men being not very violent, right? So I think that thinking about Jewish masculinity gets us something bigger too. It helps us understand that there are multiple ways of being masculine and even multiple sort of local or more specific ideals about being masculine. So what it meant to be a Jewish man in Jewish community was not identical to what it meant to be a great American man. As if that were an unmarked category, right? And so that also reminds us that across different communities, we should look for slightly different gender ideas and ideals. And so for me, that's a really great thing that we can get out of studying Jewish masculinity, is this bigger picture masculinity. We get more good questions and more specific ideas, like, oh, we should be looking for gender roles as they're enacted in more specific communities too, rather than just a really broad one.
Ronnie.
It's nice to go after you guys, hearing what you have to say. I think borrowing a little bit from both, this idea that there's not one Jewish masculinity, so that's important. And my book, my first chapter, is completely indebted to Sarah's, because it offers the different models of masculinity available in the early 20th century to Jewish men coming up on the streets in New York City, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, in the Lower East Side. And there were Jewish gangsters, there were Jewish boxers, there were Jewish basketball players. And I think one of the things that studying masculinity in Jews allows us to do is ask, how did American Jewish men become American? And I think masculinity is a really crucial way in which they do that. And there's not one vision of that, and there's not one road. Actually, Daniel Bell, who's a sociologist who I write about, has this really interesting article in 1953 following the Kavar hearings on organized crime, where he sort of argues that organized crime provided this like funny mirror flip of like the Horatio Alger tale of how to become men, you know? So I in my work, I say, the model of masculinity that I end up following, this combative Jewish masculinity that's on the written page, is not the only masculinity available. And for the New York intellectuals, they are borrowing from American culture, from Judaism. So it's kind of an amalgam of Talmudic scholarly ideas about the ideal male, about what Daniel Boyarin calls a sissy male, which he doesn't see as a negative thing. Being a scholar and arguing is positive, right? So my figures are sort of borrowing from what they imagine as their Talmudic heritage, and they'll say this later in some of their writings, but they're also borrowing from sports and from wanting to be tough and combative, but instead of it being becoming boxers, it's being combative on the written page. And as we follow them into the post-war period, Jews kind of move from outsiders to insiders in a lot of ways. We're at a moment, I think, that is, I'll come back to that, but in the sense that like anti-Semitism seems to be discredited to some extent after World War II. Certainly the idea that Jews were racially suspect is discredited. You see kind of Jews, if we're talking about the Ashkenazi majority, moving from being seen as kind of not quite white to white in the post-war years. We see Jews moving from moving like other white ethnics from urban centers into the middle class, into suburbs. In terms of religion, in World War II, Judaism becomes part of a tri-faith America. That is a World War II kind of construction. It didn't exist before. Jews and Catholics were outsiders in the early part of the 20th century. And so I think looking at how Jews navigated masculinity also tells us a story about how kind of Jews moved from insiders to outsiders. And I think the New York intellectuals and how celebrated they are is in some ways an embodiment of that. But there's also a discomfort with being part of the majority, of being part of insiders, of like losing what's Jewish or Jewishness. And so I think in studying masculinity, you can sort of see this discomfort of Jews kind of, being part of the American mainstream, but wanting to maintain a distinctive identity. And I think among the New York intellectuals, you see various ways in politics in which issues of masculinity shape their thinking in different ways, and it's kind of a discomfort to some extent in different opinions. So.
It's so fascinating because, of course, the big question of American Jewish history is always this question of like acculturate, not acculturate, like how do we become American or not become American or remain distinctive or not remain distinctive. And masculinity seems to play such a critical role, an previously perhaps unexplored role in understanding that tension that American Jews have throughout American Jewish history felt and continue to feel today. Fascinating. Okay, so I know that all of you are thinking a question that I thought also when I was meeting with this panel, which is, they're women, 3 women here, who wrote books about masculinity. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about what does it mean that all 3 of these books about Jewish masculinity were written by women scholars. And maybe we've already explored a little bit of this, but maybe to dive a little bit deeper about what is the role of women in Jewish masculinity. And okay, let me see, where am I starting now? I think I'm starting, Ronnie, I'm starting with you.
Okay, well, I'm going to leave actually the question of the 3 of us being women, and I'm going to leave that to Sarah and Miriam because we talked a little bit beforehand, and I don't know, I think that you guys had really good insights on that. I'll just sort of talk about the role of women in my book to answer the question a little bit, which there were only a handful of women who were considered New York intellectuals, and but there were lots of women who were writers who were married to these men. So who counts, who doesn't is an interesting question. And I make an argument that the women, most of them were involved with the men in the group. They were brilliant, but I argue that because they in some ways too performed a masculinity on the written page to be taken intellectually seriously. And that's not to say that there's an essentialized way to write, a masculine or a feminine way to write, but these women found themselves in between a rock and a hard place in some ways because in order to be taken seriously, they had to write like a man. I mean, this is a language that these figures, I open up my book with Jason Epstein, who helped co-found the New York Review of Books, sort of saying with women in the crowd, the first thing he thought about was whether they were good looking and you could sleep with them. But if they could write like a man, that was fine. And so there was this idea of writing like a man. But when the women, when they wrote in ways that men in this group didn't like, or they wrote books. So Mary McCarthy writes a book called The Group in 1963, which becomes a bestseller, which is about women's lives navigating from Vassar into the post-war years. The men in this group dismiss it as a mere ladies' novel, right? When Hannah Arendt, but then there's Hannah Arendt, who in 1963 publishes Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the New York, the men in this group worshipped Hannah after Origins of Totalitarianism. Now Eichmann had a lot of, it was controversial for a lot of reasons, but Norman Podhoretz calls it overly complex. That was Hannah's problem. So there's just, and then what I find interesting also is that these women rejected feminism. They were opponents of feminism. And they felt like basically because they wrote well, they wrote like a man, they wouldn't have put it that way, they didn't need feminism. And I think they dismissed feminism as distinctly unserious, as these women writing about frivolous topics, writing like a woman. Okay, and again, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that there's a way to write like a man or a way to write like a woman. It's not essentialized. But the way in which the New York intellectuals helped define the 20th century, there was this sense that in order to be a woman, making it in this group, you had to conform to these ideas of masculinity. But again, it was a difficult tight wire because you could easily be dismissed. And then it's a very interesting question why they, opposed feminism.
Yeah, go ahead, Miriam.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit, I guess, about the role women play in my book, which is not as large of a role as they play in Ronnie's book. But I do look at some, I look at a lot of different moments and turning points in the 20th century. And a lot of the, I'd say some of the most interesting quotes about the way Jewish men are performing masculinity comes from women. Which I find in a lot of the same sources. And this is a very, my book is a very dense historical book. It has a whole lot of citations and a whole lot of different kinds of sources from news and, a ton of archival sources. But some of them are from congregants who go to their rabbis and they say, it's your fault for acting so weak about our role in American society, or, the women who go to the World Zionist Congress as members of Hadassah who come back and they say that's how our men should behave, these like they should do more of these, these athletics and these games, and they should march like Zionists do in other parts of the world. So there's certainly some commentary where that comes into play in the book. I think one of the part I want to speak to more about this question is why we're women, and not why we're women, but why women are writing about this, which is, I think, there was, in Jewish history and in Jewish studies, there's this really incredible cohort of scholars who write about Jewish gender, starting with, Paula Hyman and including Deborah Dash Moore and Riv Ellen Prell, who I think her book in the early 2000s or late 90s was one of the ones that commented most on the relationships of men and women and how both genders play into these dynamics. But there's so much really wonderful literature out there on Jewish gender, which is largely on Jewish women. And the people who get into that field, were women, right? So I think there are a lot of really fantastic scholars of Jewish gender, most of whom are women, because gender and Jewish studies departments are largely, or not Jewish studies, gender and women's studies departments are largely made up of female scholars. And I think that's kind of where, I think that we're growing out of that legacy, and we're using the language that they've established and the amazing work that they've come up with and we're expanding it. And I do think it's worth noting that there are male scholars who are writing about this. Certainly there are male scholars who've written about masculinity, but Jewish Masculinity, a book about millennial Jewish stars, came out this year by Jonathan Bronfman, and it talks about masculinity and whiteness. And so, there are people working. I think the kind of untapped field here, which I hope will be all of our books will help with, is I think someone's got to write a book about Jewish homosexual identity and Jewish queer identities as they relate to America throughout the 20th century, as opposed to just presentist, arguments based on intersectionalism. But I think there's a whole separate history there, dating back to pre-mass migration in Europe, and I think that's kind of next. And I do imagine that there will be more of a diversity of gender among the scholars who are examining that topic. But I think it's really about where the language comes from, and I think this field, which is just thanks to Sarah's book, just kind of opening up of Jewish masculinity as a topic of very worthy of real academic study. I think that it's going to expand, and there's going to be a whole lot more buy-in. But I think that's one of the reasons that it's women sitting up here now.
Sarah.
These are great. Thank you for your answers. One thing I would add to this is that academic books take an incredibly long time to write, and some of that is the problem of the people writing them, and some of them is the process, which includes peer review, which makes it take much longer than many other kinds of books. But one of the reasons I think we've seen a shift is because of the Me Too movement. That I think that after 2018 or so, it became harder to ignore masculinity as a cultural force, as a thing that individual people were performing. And it became an important topic in Jewish communities, as many of you know. So I also think, Miriam, that moving forward, we really can and do expect that people of all genders are going to write about this, because it is much more widely recognized as a cultural issue. Generally, we can have different kinds of masculinity. It's not just men are always like X in an essential way. And also, what does it mean to have a Jewish masculinity? Let's sit and talk about that and sit with this. In the wake of Me Too, that was part of that conversation. So I do think that if we had this panel 10 years from now and we're looking at who's writing about Jewish masculinity, we're going to have a more diverse set of scholars. Whereas prior to 2018, I think it's true to say that many of the scholars who went into women and gender studies were likely to be women or gender nonconforming people. I think that's also not totally an accident. if you are a woman or a gender nonconforming person, you are likely to feel the weight of gender in your own life in more moments than if you are a totally gender conforming cis white man. So I not that has fully gone away, but I think that we're culturally generally moving toward a sense that masculinity is not just one fixed thing that we don't have to think about, but rather that it is an important part of both individual lives and communal lives.
Ronnie, you wanted to add something?
Well, I was just thinking, I think that when I first told someone in graduate school that there were like no books on American Jewish masculinity. So this was before your book came out. I dated myself early, the 2000s. He was a scholar of European history, actually. He was director of grad students, and he sort of laughed at me, didn't believe it. And I think I'm just sort of thinking, so I think maybe in Jewish, there were some early books in Jewish studies. I'm thinking of George Moss and Daniel Boyarin that came out. And I also think that in American history, 20th century, there were books on masculinity, looking especially at how masculinity shaped politics, like the Cold War, Men in the Middle. But I think American Jewish history was a bit late. And Sarah's book was really the first in 2017 to really, well, there was Paul Bryan's, I should say, in 1990. I should be careful always to say the first. But she pioneered a moment, and I don't know why it might have been that American Jewish historians were behind, perhaps so many were women and were focusing on the importance of women's history in Jewish studies, which is like a whole nother thing. But it was just something that occurred to me as I was hearing you guys talk.
So fascinating. Okay, I have one last question for you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And that's to kind of, something that historians hate is bringing things up to the present moment. I actually just had the opportunity to interview my doctoral advisor for something for the Leo Baeck Institute's 70th anniversary. And I had to ask her something about, the future of the Leo Baeck Institute. And she said, historians don't like to talk about the future. We only talk about the past. And we don't know how to talk about the future. Too bad. So how do you see Jewish masculinity playing out in this moment? And maybe what are the questions that we might see going forward? And so you've touched on some of them already, but let's see. I don't even know who I'm up to. Sarah, I'm starting with you.
Thanks. So I'm officially trained as a religious studies scholar.
Oh, there you go. So maybe you can talk about the present and future.
I can. And I will also say that any historian who tells you they never think about the present or they don't want to talk about the present is full of it. That's part of how we all decide what parts of the past we think are important, right? What stories from the past do we want to tell? That comes to us from our lives and our contemporary moments. What seems pressing? What do we really want to understand? Yep. And so I would say that, so here's an example of one of the things that I thought about, because I just mentioned Me Too. Thinking about Jewish masculinity, one of the things that was pressing for thinking about my book and what it means for our contemporary world is this idea that Jewish men are good family men. They don't indulge in vices like alcoholism. They don't engage in partner abuse. These are stereotypes that are bought into by many Jewish communities and and the wider world at large. And one of the stumbling blocks here is that means it's very difficult to get care or to have people understand what you're going through if you are, say, a victim of domestic abuse. And Jewish communities have done a whole bunch to move in better directions here to say, you know what? It's not an ideal. We don't think it's something Jewish men should do, but now we understand that this is a thing that can happen in Jewish families too. So I think understanding that ideas of Jewish masculinity can and do change, and also that ideas of Jewish masculinity don't in fact dictate each person's individual life are really crucial for us. So I think in this moment, moving toward more flexible definitions and sometimes also moving toward the idea that, just because we have these ideas about what it means to be a Jewish man doesn't mean that that will be the case for every single person. I also think expanding ideas of gender, one of the things that's really helpful about all of these books together, saying there are multiple kinds of masculinity, really helps us think about the multiple kinds of gender. We're seeing an expansion of gender beyond a binary. Many people who are especially millennials and younger generations say, yeah, we don't feel like we want to play by the gender rules that say you have to be a man or a woman. And if you're a man, you have to do all the masculine things. And if you're a woman, you have to do all the feminine things. We know those are constructions, and maybe they don't feel like authentic expressions of ourselves or authentic expressions of our Jewish selves. And I think if we note, historically, it's also been true that there's not one solid, unchanging masculinity or one solid, unchanging femininity. It really makes space for multiple genders beyond those two.
Ronnie, I'm going to go to you and then Miriam.
I'm going to take in a different direction, just in thinking of where do we see Jewish masculinity today, at least from the perspective of my book. I was not on Twitter. I was on Facebook, the old school one, before my book came out, but my publicist had sort of encouraged me to, do a Twitter account. And I will say that, and my book has received attention in ways that were surprising to me and have been amazing beyond the academy. So I think there's a cohort of sort of left-wing journalists and younger, many male, but not only, who have been sort of see the New York intellectual. I mean, I also think the New York intellectuals just have this like aura that's, I don't know, magical, and it's crazy. But I think that they see themselves in some ways as heirs of this combative tradition. So I was just gonna say, not that it's all Jewish, but I see like an argumentative engagement with the world, particularly among secular Jews, often leftists, not all of them, playing out in Twitter. It's toxic now. Twitter's toxic. And people are moving to blue sky. But I think part of why my book appealed to outside academia in this way, at least among this certain journalists, was because they see themselves as heirs of this, or they imagine maybe. I mean, I don't know if they would say that outright, but they imagine a little bit.
Go ahead, Miriam.
So I published an article in 2020 I think a week before the election about Jewish masculinity, so-called white masculinity, and Trump and the Bernie Bros. Bernie Bros, yeah. and I mean, I think that, I guess I'm gonna boil it down to the basics. I think that you don't need to look far to see how important Jewish masculinity is to everything that's going on right now. But if you just look at what, say, the protest signs say, I think that the Women's March in 2016, and I'm not picking a side here in any of what I'm about to say. I'm just going to lay out some things. But, the accusations of Zionism as being anti-feminist or pulling Zionists out of the Women's March, I think says something about how important Jewish gender is in these discussions, whether people recognize it or not. I think if you looked at the encampments on campuses over the last year and saw the amount of signs that said things like Palestinian liberation equals trans liberation, and just take a big step back and try to complicate that. There's a lot packed in there about the ideas of Jewish gender that have not emerged from what we're talking about, but that have emerged in the last 30 years, the last 50 years, pretty much since the moment my book leaves off, for good reason, about gender emerging out of Israel, and ideas of Jewish masculinity and militarism coming out of the Middle East, and how people are now viewing Jews on a global stage, and the ways in which they largely, I believe, unconsciously connect that to gender, right? They connect it to Jewish feminism. They connect it to their kind of unknown beliefs about Jewish female aggression. They connect it to Zionism and what they see as a hyper-masculine militarism coming out of Israel. And then they connect this all to what Jews are doing in the United States, whether or not there is any connection, right? So I don't think you can look at the Jewish role in current events and understand it without thinking about what we're talking about up here, because it really does. It really plays into, I mean, I can tell you it wasn't in my introduction, but my current role right now is as managing director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute at the University of Michigan. And I can tell you that what's happening on campus there, intersectionalism comes into all of the discussions around the encampment, around Zionism and anti-Zionism, beliefs about what Jews are and are not doing. You know, it is all so tied in. And one of the things that I say throughout my book is that anti-Semitism is an inherently gendered bigotry, that there's so much gender built into the fabric of that particular hatred. And I think all three of us actually in our books do some unpacking of that in ways that, you know, everybody should read.
Wow. So that was incredible. I feel like I have even more questions than I had before we started, which is the sign of a good panel in my mind. I want to open it up to the audience and see if anyone has questions for our panelists. Yeah, go ahead.
So this sort of relates to what you were saying, that, like, you know, the next book hopefully that someone writes is about Jewish queerness and gender. And one of the books that I read in college a long time ago that, like, has stayed with me is The Straight State by Margot Canaday, which about how tracing from, like, you know, the early 20th century, how the state via immigration or the military, et cetera, like, legalize, like, what gender is. And I'm curious if, like, in your research, especially Sarah and Miriam, like, if you saw how that intersected with, like, either how the hegemon and sort of like the America at large, or Jews sort of then, like, reacted to their own understandings of, like, gender, or, like, ideal gender, or assimilation and acculturation.
So
Maybe repeat the question also for people. I don't know if everybody in the back
yes.
heard.
So the question is, how do Jews react to or respond to state versions of judging and instantiating gender? I'm going to give a little side answer to this because I think it's a great story and helps illustrate something about historical difference. So in the early 20th century, there aren't a lot of traces of this person, but there was a person named Ben Rosenstein who lived in Chicago and died. And when Ben dies, it turns out everyone says, "Oh, this person was a woman," and still Ben is buried in his favorite suit because that's who his family thinks he should be. I'm using masculine pronouns. The newspaper articles use feminine pronouns, but Ben, it is clear, was married to a woman. They got married, and so that means when they got married that the state hadn't assigned Ben a gender that didn't work for marrying a woman. And I think one of the reasons that this worked effectively for Ben was that he had a job that was associated with men. He earned money that was associated with male wages rather than female wages, which were lower. And here I think is a great example of, we see the state is not so involved that it is invested in identifying people's genders or classifying people's genders if they are doing gender according to what the state kind of assumes. Like, oh, you're marrying a woman, you're doing a job that's associated with a man, you're dressing like a man, you're not registering as a problem for us, right? You're performing masculinity in, like, the regular ways, and so we're not going to assign you. This is a story that would be unlikely to happen today because of the way that our lives are kept track of and monitored and decided by state things. So I think that it's a really cool, for me, historical example of the way that we might imagine, oh, today gender is more flexible than it has ever been. But actually, gender is just flexible in slightly different ways than it used to be. And this state way is a way that gender is actually maybe a little less flexible.
Interesting. Miriam, you want to add anything?
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting line that you draw between, like, legal and social or cultural practice and, like, definitions. I think that I have some of what I think you're asking about in the early chapters of my book when I talk about the immigration process. But I think, I mean, and especially, like, at Ellis Island or at Angel Island, that's where things are, you know, mental illness is diagnosed, and I think that's kind of where some of that comes in. But I think even more so by, like, the military there's kind of these definitions of ableness that are relevant, and like assumptions in like the medical advisor or the medical advisory board published, statements about like Jews being malingerers and Jews being weak and all these sort of things, which kind of tie into the perception of masculinity. But I think much more, at least if you're thinking about looking for this in my book, at least much more of it is about the kind of social practice of the social change and reinforcing of gender. So, for example, migrant communities during the mass migration period, Jewish migrants who came over had very different perceptions of what a woman should and could do. Like women were breadwinners in Europe. Jewish women were breadwinners because there were different laws legislating what Jews could and couldn't engage in. And then they had to adapt in the United States to the cult of domesticity. So they had to stop working in a lot of ways in order to be women. But that's much more social. But I think that the legal question is a really interesting one, even though I can't add much better than what Sarah did.
Other questions from the audience? In the back.
Yeah. So I have a whole chapter about American Jewish masculinity as it relates to Zionism, and there's a wrinkle here. And the wrinkle is the vast majority of American Zionists did not view America as diaspora or exile. And so the story that you get in Europe, which is places that are not Israel, Palestine, are emasculating. And the only thing that will get us back to a real strong masculinity is going back to that place. Even American Zionists who are really excited about a Zionist project do not see America as somehow emasculating or a problem for masculinity. So they'll perform their Zionist masculinity through other kinds of masculinity like philanthropy, but they don't see their own environment as emasculating. And so it doesn't... There's a slightly different tenor than there is for many Europeans who keep telling the story that like, oh, Europe is emasculating because it's not the land. Whereas Americans are like, yeah, but the vast majority of us are going to stay here. This is home for us. We're Zionists because we think this is an important project for the idea of a Jewish people or for Jewish self-determination or as a safe haven for other Jews to be able to go there. But we don't feel like we need to go there to fix our own bodies.
I'll add to that, though, that there are also some, and this is like one of the only points I think I took, and I wouldn't even say took issue, but I took this point in your book and moved forward in time with it. Because I do think that there are, especially later, like with revisionist Zionists coming to the United States during the Second World War, who are like setting up the Beit Harim camps, and we've got Jabotinsky comes to the U.S. and sets up these, and they are absolutely trying to engage in this muscular Judaism, looking at Israel and coming back with reports and saying, oh, Israelis are rebuilding their bodies there. We need to go there. We need to do this too. And I do think it had some of that, but I agree with Sarah that there's this separation that even American Zionists, for the most part, did still think they had found, this home in the U.S. that allowed them to flourish more. And I also have 2 chapters that deal with Zionism, and a whole one of those is about muscular Zionism in that movement. So. Oh yeah, sorry.
So I think I'm going to go even later. It's good order. For the neoconservatives, 1967 is a crucial moment. I argue that gender anxiety is actually about Jewish masculinity and also about masculinity more broadly. take the story of neoconservatism early. It's not just a reaction to the late 60s. That's one of my major interventions. But I think that 67 is a point where Norman Podhoretz, who's the editor of Commentary magazine, notices Jewish masculinity as sort of muscular. And I'm not, I think other Americanist historians, I'm thinking of Melanie McAllister, who teaches, I think, at George Washington. She talks about Israel becoming a model of militarism, muscular, manly militarism, not just for the neoconservatives, but conservatives more broadly, precisely at a moment where the United States seems to be losing in Vietnam. So sometimes when I teach this in my class, I have a picture of Life magazine showing a soldier in Vietnam in 66 or 67 where the US is being battered, right, to some extent, or in a quagmire is a better word, with this victorious picture of a muscular Israeli after the Six-Day War. Right, so I think for conservatives, and then there's this discourse about a Vietnam syndrome, right, that if we're not muscular or tough and remain in the world, we're going to suffer this weak defeat. And Israel becomes a model for a lot of conservatives, certainly for the neocons, of a people and a military doing it right in sort of these masculine terms. And Norman Podhoretz is really interesting if we take it up to Trump, because a lot of the neocons were at least in 2016, I think even through the most recent election, were anti-Trumpers. America First harkened back to an isolationist foreign policy. A lot of them saw it as a rebuke of neoconservatism, of this engagement with the preemptive war, right, endless war. And so Norman Podhoretz has this really interesting interview with the Claremont Institute in 2019, where he sort of says, I was initially anti-Trump. I heard his language. I thought of it as Buchananite, isolationist. But then over the course of his presidency, I became anti-Trump. He got annoyed with all the people building on anti-communists. And in this 2000, and then he says he appointed John Bolton from the point of a neocon is really great. And his son-in-law, Elliot Abrams, served also in the Trump administration. And so, he's actually, engaging with the world. And he says at the end of this interview, the one thing that Trump is he's a fighter. He's not a sissy, and Americans want a fighter. And I will say that Norman Podhoretz has a very famous article from 1963 called My Negro Problem and Ours, where he says he was called a sissy, and that was the worst epithet of American boyhood. So now I can't remember where I was going, but I think it all made sense.
It definitely
Totally,
did.
yeah.
I wish we had time for more questions. We've run out of time, but I'm sure that our panelists will be willing to stay for a few minutes if anyone wants to come over and ask them questions. Thank you. And yes, definitely get your book signed by these incredible, incredible scholars. Ronnie Grinberg, Miriam Mora, Sarah Imhoff, thank you so much. This is such a rich discussion.
And thank you, Laura.
Thank you.